Okay, welcome to Chapter 5. This is going to cover business ethics, a somewhat debatable point because um, some philosophers, some thinkers, even some businessmen would claim that ethics is really not an appropriate topic or is really part of business in some ways. I would disagree with that, but let's delve into this. Okay, so what are we talking about ethics here? Well, if we define that morality is determining what is right, then ethics is doing what is right. Once you decide that something is a good and or not a bad, okay, what do you do about it? And it's something, of course, that human philosophers have debated and talked about for centuries. This is not something we're going to solve tonight, not something I'm going to give you the great secret to the universe about, but I think we can touch on a few things here. So, how does this impact business? Well, one of the uh, fundamental questions here is, you know, what's right and wrong in the business world? And how should we approach that issue? And as I said, some people, famously, some very important economists would say, right and wrong has almost nothing to do with business. And that it's merely what is profitable, arguably, that what is business. Um, it is, however, when you think about making an ethical decision, whether it's in business or not, a balancing act. How do you balance one good against another, or one crucial decision against another? You know, there was a famous book, um, 10 plus years ago now, probably closer to 20, and later movie called Sophie's Choice. And the choice was in the book, and there were several meanings to that term, but the fundamental choice in that was there was a woman who was confronted by a Nazi, and she had two children. And the Nazi said, "Give me one of the children, and I'm going to kill him, but I'll let the other one live. Now, both of these are your children. One is your daughter, one is your son. Make the choice." So, here's the question. Obviously, it's a lousy decision to have to make. And is there a right answer? And she tried to say, take me instead, let my kids live. And the Nazi said, no, one or the other. So you would have to balance certain factors. You would have to look at certain things to arrive at an ethical decision. And like I said, it's not always just the right decision. There's right on both sides there. But what is ethical? Now, at a very basic level in business, if you act ethically, it should allow you to avoid jail. Now, we're going to assume that the law itself is ethical. If on the other hand, something the law is doing is unethical or immoral, then the famous quote is in an immoral society or with an immoral law, the only ethical place for a person to be is in jail. So if you took famously Martin Luther King's letters from an Alabama jail or Birmingham jail, um, if you were living in a society that says blacks go to the back of the bus, blacks get second-class citizenship, blacks shouldn't be allowed to vote, and the only way you can change that is to break the law. Shouldn't you break the law? Isn't it ethical, in fact, to break the law? So I'm not sure your book is completely right when it says ethical behavior allows you to avoid going to jail. I think sometimes, in fact, ethical behavior compels you to go to jail. I think, hopefully, that we recognize that unethical behavior causes suffering. And if someone is suffering because of your behavior, that is a strong indication that your behavior is unethical. Now, that's not always the case. A surgeon can save a person's life by taking out their appendix, and that person suffers pain, but he is provided with a greater benefit. It's almost impossible to construct a scenario where inflicting pain on others for your own benefit isn't an unethical act, or to allow others to suffer is an unethical act. And there we get into, substantial issues with business. Okay, why do ethical problems arise? Well, I think it's fair to say that at its core, there is a fundamental conflict between acquiring material goods or making money and acting ethically, because sometimes, at least, it appears that you can make more money by acting unethically. That's why some philosophers, economists would say the only business of a corporation is to make money. A corporation doesn't act ethical because it's not an ethical being. One could argue, however, that if you are just focused on making money, you're just focused on the narrow profit, then you will quite probably maximize your short-term results, but you may in the long term harm yourself and your company. So, quick example, you make a product that's inferior, but the inferior nature of it won't be plain for a year or two. You can sell the product now, it's cheaper than the other products in the market, seems to do more than the other products in the market, but within a year it will prove itself to be dangerous or defective. Well, right now, you don't disclose this problem, you don't deal with this problem, you simply sell. Sell, sell, sell. Well, in the short term, yes, your company makes money. But in the long term, oh my God, this comes up. This is terrible. Will people in the future trust your company? You can see an example here with the loan crisis of 2008, where many, many banks lent money, with little hope of return of that money because they were making so much money creating the loan. I think we also have to recognize that sometimes there is pressure by corporations and by business to shape what the law is. And one of the ways you can avoid breaking the law is you can be the person that makes it. You can be the person that shapes it. So an example, if an employee reaches his hand into the till of the business and takes money out of the cash register drawer, we're all going to recognize that as a crime. And he'll be arrested and he can even go to prison. But if a boss of a company doesn't pay overtime, he's supposed to, but he doesn't. There's not a lot of law that says that's a theft, let's put that person in jail. Let's put that person in prison. So in part that's because of the way the law has been drafted and written. And so you can have ethical behavior by create unethical situations simply by shaping the law to your own desire. I do think it is important to talk about leadership. Leadership, by example, for good or for bad, can set the overall tone of behavior. If you have an individual who says, Wells Fargo is a good example of this. Wells Fargo recently got in trouble again because it turned out they were opening up bank accounts for people without their permission and maximizing profits. Where'd this come from? Well, in part it came from the leadership at the top, where the leadership at the top said, you need to open so many accounts. This is what we require of you. And those that perform this will receive bonuses and will be rewarded, and those that don't will be fired. And essentially, we're going to wink at you and say, whatever it takes. An even more extreme example, yesterday I was reading in the news where a pharmaceutical company acknowledged that they knew the danger of opiates. They knew that some of the pills they were supplying to pharmacies were being diverted. They knew that addiction was happening. They knew that death was happening, but they were making so much money that they didn't want to stop. Now, obviously, that came from the top. So sometimes when an owner, and this can include shareholders, just demands profit, it can compel management or workers to act in particular ways, including unethical ways. Okay, Here's an example. And somewhat ironically, there's some updates I can give you here. In the run-up to the big banking freeze and the collapse of 2008, one of the things banks were doing in particular was they were buying back their own stock. Between 2005 and 2008, U.S. banks bought $1.4 trillion worth of their own stock. And why did they do that? Well, because very often bank executives or the health of a bank was looked at based upon their stock price. So they said, well, we've got money. We could invest this. We might not grow very fast, but you know what we could do with it? We could buy our own stock. When you're buying stock and limiting the amount available, the price is going to go up. So we'll get bigger bonuses. You can also look at the decisions of AIG, which is American International Group. It took tremendous risks and ultimately had to be bailed out to the tune of $100 billion. Later managed to turn a lot of this around and a lot of this money's recovered, but the point being, the executives saw the company as something that would provide them with benefit and weren't concerned about the long term. James Fund of Lehman Brothers took $500 million in payouts of profit over 8 years. So essentially, he was earning, $50+ million a year. Goldman Sachs awarded $16.5 billion bonuses in 2006 alone, and this right before, a year literally before the Great Crash. Now, I mention that because, of course, in 2016 there was a major legislation passed. There was a very large tax cut, and a large amount of money was returned to corporate interests, particularly banks again. Well, what did these corporations do with that money? Well, one of the things they did was they repeated exactly what they did between 2005 and 2008. They took the vast bulk of that money. They didn't invest it in new machinery or new workers. They purchased their own stock back. So the stock market remained high, so they did well, so they earned more money. Now let's talk a little bit about using social media here. Can you hire based upon participation in social media? So, many people are on Facebook or Twitter or, I guess we go way back, MySpace, things like that. Can we look at how they participate in their social realms? Can we say, well, he seems to go to church a lot. I don't think I want to hire him. He seems to be a diehard member of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party. How much can we use social media to inform our decision? Can companies control what you post? So let's suppose you work for a company, and the company says, all right, if you're going to work for UPS, United Parcel Post Service, you can't post anything negative about Parcel Post. And if you do, we'll fire you. Well, I'm not doing this during my work hours. I'm doing this after my work hours. My work product is good. I'm doing exactly what you require me to do. Well, we should be able to control what you say after work. So this can be a thorny issue, how much companies can use social media to deal with these issues. Okay, so how do we determine what to do? How do we determine the practical way to behave? Now, there's two major systems that we're going to talk about. Now, before we do that, we will deal with religious standards. It is, after all, a religious university here. You can fall back to say, well, what did God say? And you can look at the 10 Commandments. But I would argue that even the 10 Commandments suffer from the same problem of, well, it's very short. It's going to call for ethical interpretation. It may say, thou shalt not kill. It doesn't say anything about war. Does that mean we have to be pacifists? The two primary ideas that are focused on is duty-based ethics, and then we'll look at outcome-based ethics as well, a little bit in just a bit. But the primary person that shaped this is a philosopher called Immanuel Kant, arguably the greatest philosopher of the modern age. And what he did was he created a practical mechanism to ethically judge behavior. He said, if you want to know if something is ethical, this is what you do. Assume that everyone in society has the freedom to act in that way. Will that be positive or negative? So if I told you you can steal from the company and get $1 million, well, that's very good for you. But if I tell you if everybody stole $1 million from the company goes bankrupt and nobody has a job, then the categorical imperative, and I'm using a very simplified example there, would tell you that action is wrong. Kant also argues that human beings are not means to an end. Human beings are end themselves. You can't use a person to accomplish something because the human being is the end. You can, and you should, ask how your act impacts other people. And you, of course, have issues with, well, how do we determine what is a right thing to do and how do we prioritize that right? The other major alternative system, which was developed by someone from Britain called Jeremy Bentham, is called utilitarianism. And this one addresses the issue of what's right and wrong. It says what is right and how you do it is what is good for the greatest number of people. So should the price of bread be high or should the price of bread be low? Well, it should be low because that's good for most people that eat bread, not most people that sell bread. And it really requires a sort of cost-benefit analysis. Now, the problems with this is there's no absolute right or wrong in this system. And who gets to make this judgment? And what's the relative value of things? So, for example, could you sacrifice a small number of people for a greater benefit? There's a very famous story. And it posits this, and this is something I want you to think about. You live in a city which is beautiful and peaceful and has everything you could want. It's got an educated population, it's got beautiful art, it's got wonderful sports, the people are healthy, the people are happy. And on your 18th birthday, you are taken down to a lower level of the city you've never seen, you're brought into a dungeon, and you see this child. This child is chained up, and this child is beaten, and this child is abused, and this child is suffering every day of its life. And the person running the jail says, the reason we can have everything above here, the reason we can have all this happiness, all this beauty, all this health, all this art, is this suffering. And if you stay in the city, just be aware that so long as you live here and have all these benefits, that there will be this small child, I guess a new one every year arguably, or every other year or something, tied up, chained, beaten, abused in this prison. So the question is, who walks away? Is it okay to do this? If I told you I could lower the crime rate in the United States if I impose a very quick and rapid death penalty, if I give the police the authority to shoot a suspect on site, I could drop the crime rate by 20% or 40% or 50%. But I also tell you they'll be killing innocent people. How many are you going to let me kill? Under utilitarianism, greatest good, greatest number. Corporate social responsibility. Something else to think about when you look at ethical situations here is, how can you judge if a corporation is acting ethically? Whose perspective do we look at? The corporation isn't alive. Is it the people that own the corporation? Is it the shareholders? Do they say, I want it to act responsible? I mean, many of you own shares of stock in a mutual or fund or something for your retirement. Do you ever say, well, gee, I wonder if Apple is acting ethically? Is it the workers? Is it the customers? Is it the management? Who judges and how? So should the corporation promote the goals of society or not? Should it seek equality and fairness or not? One of the things that we talk about is that we want to provide ethical training for employees. Now, your book really skips a step here, and I think it's worth addressing very quickly, and that's the argument is, can you teach ethical behavior? Is it subject to learning and obeying? Does that work? And I think at the very base, we have to have a reporting of ethical behavior. We have to know what's going on. And then we have to ask the questions, is this good? Is this bad? So are ethics good for business? Some people argue yes. So the basic guidelines you should look at if you look for ethical behavior, first of all, is what is legal? This is the moral minimum. What is legal? But that's not enough of an evaluation. Then, what rules and procedures are you following? And what values are you upholding? Are you saying, well, society doesn't require me to hire people that have disabilities, but I'm going to go out of my way to hire people that have developmental disabilities so they can have a good life. Is that good for business? What does your conscience tell you? What promises have been made? What do heroes or examples set as a guideline? All of these, I think, are legitimate issues to ask. Practically, I think you need a loop. You need a system. One of the things you have to know before you can make a decision that's ethical is you have to know the facts. So a corporation has to constantly inquire into what are the facts. Is our manufacturing of, pick a commodity, cell phones, ethical? Well, let's look at the facts. Who's making them? What are they being paid? How much? Then have a discussion. What actions are going on here and what options exist? Are there other options that are different? All right? Then make a decision. Let the decision be a conscious decision. Yes, we're going to locate our factory in Thailand, not China, because Thailand treats its workers better, or it's a freer society, or some issue like that. All right, great. State your justification. Explain why you're doing it. Be honest about that. Don't say, well, it's just cheaper to do it in China, or it's cheaper to do it here, or cheaper to do it there. And then I think you have to repeat it. You have to evaluate this. Did this work? Did it create an ethical solution? If you say, well, we weren't happy with what was going on in China because people were being held as slaves in factories and suicide, it was terrible, so we moved it to Thailand. So it would be better. All right, great. Evaluate it. Did it work? How is the conditions in Thailand? Are they any better? Are they worse? Then you have to go back to the beginning of this and seek another ethical solution. Now, of course, you do have problems in that you don't operate just in the United States. And you have to ask, should you follow the values or laws of your country or other countries? And, what happens if you go to a society that it's just common to pay a bribe in? One of the most shocking things I read, I'll give you an example. The American military, when it's in Afghanistan, came across what they call chai boys. Chai means tea. The Afghan culture, part of it, had a lot of restrictions of men and women interacting. And what they did allow was for some Afghan men to buy boys, called chai boys, and to sexually use them. And then when they got old enough to sell them. It was part of their society. So the Americans come in. You're fighting a war now against the Taliban. Some of your allies, you roll up to a base, and the commander there is a nice guy, and he's fighting the Taliban, and he says, oh, let me introduce you to my chai boy. So here's my question for you. What's the ethical thing to do? Do you say, well, we're going to take that kid away. We're going to free that kid. How? The law says it's okay. Well, we're not going to fight for you. We are going to fight for you. What do you do? So you can have an issue of, do you follow your values or the values and the laws of the country you operate in? And when they conflict, what do you do? And I think these questions remain major issues for everybody to deal with. All right, we'll leave it there. We will pick up with a whole new unit. That'll be Chapter 6, Torts, coming up. We're really going to be kind of changing gears a little bit, focusing a little bit more on the law. And I will talk to you with Chapter 6.